Alright, so this is the video for the upgrades for the Meals app. As you can see on the side, this is what my Meals app currently looks like now. After all the upgrades I made, I changed the background and the coloring of the actual UI, as well as changed up the images that you get in the categories, as well as the favorites tab. And when you actually go and over to click on the favorites, you can see each name actually pops up when you actually click on it. So it doesn't actually show both names when it's just showing, it only shows the name once you actually click on the tab. You can see right now I have no favorites actually added, so it has a screen that just says you have no favorites, start adding some. And when you actually go and look, here's one that is one of the bigger changes that I've added. Going into the French category, and you click on the souffle. This is what I changed the background and actual steps screen to. As you can see, I put this little background in between for each of the ingredients and the steps. And you can see you can actually scroll to see all the different ingredients that you're going to need, as well as you can scroll down on the page and go through all the different steps. That way all the steps aren't just all compressed into one page, and it's not, you don't have to scroll the entire page to actually look through all the steps. You can actually just hold on the steps actual box and scroll through that way all the way to the top. And just like before, you click the button in the bottom right for the favorites, go all the way back, check over, and here is the favorites already added in. So looking at the actual slide for PowerPoint, here is the upgrades that I've done. So the first thing that I just showed was the updated UI. I changed the background coloring of the app, the shapes of the icons, allowed for steps to be in for the food to be in a single scroll option, and I reworked the favorites tab with the little icons for the words as well as the images that actually shows up. As well as two other upgrades that I was working on was a login screen where the app would bring you to a login screen when you actually first run the app, where it asks for a username and a password for you to log in, and then it would take you to the page with all of the different categories. And the other upgrade that I was working on was a review slider, which was basically a screen that would come up once you actually click on one of the foods, like the chocolate souffle, and would give you a slide option to go through about 6 different options of if the food was ranging between not great to all the way to amazing, so you'd be able to choose how you rated each different food. So for the login screen, what I was working on using for the packages slash Flutter concepts was using Firebase, which was the Google Firebase that we were introduced to not too long ago, as well as the text form field. For the review slider, it was actually a pub.dev package called reviews_slider, and that was how I was actually able to use that to try and implement that in. For the actual login screen and review slider, I wasn't actually able to fully flush out how to use that, how to implement it fully. I have the code set out for it, I just haven't been able to actually get it to actually be implemented inside of the code. For the login screen, it took me about 2 hours to try and figure out how to actually set that whole thing up using Firebase and trying to connect that into the app. And for the review slider, it took me about 2.5 hours to figure out how the PubDev package actually worked and how it functioned, as well as trying to actually implement that inside of my app. And as for the updated UI, I was just again using for the Flutter concepts, which we've already been using, but I just changed up some things using the single child scroll view, as well as a list view builder for the actual list that was actually being showed for the ingredients and steps to actually be fit into one different column. And that took about 2.5 hours to actually fix up everything. So for the actual changes, so I've made changes throughout the different app tabs as well as actually changing up some of the files. Starting in the main.dart file, this is where I made a considerable change in comparison to how the app started. Most of the main.dart file was actually pretty empty, but now I have a lot of things already in there, including my app state, which included for the Boolean variables for the gluten, lactose, vegetarian, vegan options for the filters to actually filter out some of the options of the food, as well as setting the actual filters. I moved into the main.dart file and the actual toggle favorites, which will allow you to actually click on the little button and send the food and send the meals that you chose into the actual favorites file. And if we actually scroll down here, you can see right here is where I actually was trying to implement the login screen. So all of this text here was what I was using to actually try and add in a login screen. So at the top, I just made a class called login app and use it as a key. using a widget build to actually just be able to make it for the login screen. And that actual class called login screen is right here, which I use the final text editing controller to actually try to get a username as well as a password. And I try to use a Boolean variable that would say if the authentication logic was here, if the login was actually correct and it actually worked, then it would actually go through. If not, then it would return false. Going down here, we actually have the build that I was going to use for the actual login page. Here I had the text for login, and inside I used a column inside of a child widget to actually make the username controller, which would just be under the title username, and a text field right here for password controller, which would have been for the actual password. And I use obscure text for true to actually just hide the password so that when you're actually typing, it just should show like a little asterisk instead of actually showing your password that you put in. Here I use flat button and use the on press using an async to actually be able to let you actually press on to where you need to put the username and password, actually let you type everything out. And you can see as it says await login, so it's basically just waiting for you to actually enter in the username or the password controller. And if it actually worked, then it would actually push you into the actual next page, which would have been the categories which showed all the different types of food. And if it didn't work, then it would be right here, and it would actually display an error message that says login failed, please try again, and it would send you back to the login page. Here, this is where I actually used flat button, which is basically just required an on press and required a text child widget for that. And here, just finishing up for the home page, saying welcome to the home screen. This would basically just be in like the top corner, where it would just be able to actually show you just on the home page. That was basically the home page would have been the login screen. Moving over for the actual updated UI as well as the single child scroll view for the actual ingredients and steps. That's in the category meals screen. Going down here, we have the change dependencies to actually map out everything as a string and string for the title and the ID, as well as being able to remove a meal from the actual favorite section. Now scrolling over, it was in the meal detail screen. This is where you check. Here is the actual thing for the slide review slider. Here's the package for the review slider, which is what I use for the PubDev package. Right here is the list that would actually store everything. As you can see, it would start in the middle as OK, which I go down a little bit to explain that, but basically it starts a counter, an integer counter at OK, and that's where it basically start in the middle of the slider. That way you can choose to either scroll backwards to go to terrible or bad, or scroll towards the right, which would make it good or great for the food. Right here, we actually have string selected value of text, which is basically being able to actually store the variable name from that list. And if we go down here, this is where I use the build widget for this, using the build section title for the ingredients as well as the steps. And this just basically set the colors as well as just the size of the actual text button. Going down here, I made another build widget actually to use for the review slider, which would set the initial value at 3, which is basically in the middle, which was the OK section, and allow you to, when on change, it would allow you to actually change which slider you wanted it to, which actual string you change it. Using the set state would actually rebuild in the app and make sure that it would store the value in this selected value of text. It would store the value of whichever slider string that you landed on and left it as. And here's just where I just set the colors. I set the color of it. This was all being able to actually implement inside the meals detail screen. However, I wasn't able to actually just get the screen to pop up. I wasn't actually able to get the review slider to actually pop up once it was actually going through there. And going through the rest of this was just through the category items, which is just the ID, title, and color, which had already been implemented through there, as well as this was just for the actual meal items, each different one, just for how simplistic, how challenging, how hard this was. This was all pretty much just a little bit of reworking here and there, just making sure that all the radiuses were circular, just making sure that they were all rounded off instead of being all squared or pointed off in the corners. And I'm just searching for the right, that was that. And yeah, this was for the favorite screen. Actually, here it is. This is where, for the build context, just being able to add in the ID, the title, the image URL, the duration, the complexity, and the authority. Basically, just shrunk that down into just meal item and just left it inside of the builder function right there. And after that, this is where you just put in all the drawers to actually put in all the different types of foods for the filters, doing the only include gluten meals, only include lactose, vegetarian, or vegan. That's where this was set up for that. And after all that, that is all the upgrades that I added into this new categories or meals app.